Welcome to the Cloud Currents podcast, a place where you can hear insights from experts who are revolutionizing how businesses thrive in the cloud. I'm Matt Brickey. I'm Senior Vice President of Professional Services at TierPoint, and I am responsible for our consulting and public cloud business units. This episode is going to explore cost optimization strategies and how benchmarking performance can help enterprises innovate their IT operations. Today, we're joined by Samir Karande. Samir is the founder and CEO of Zopt, a company providing a SaaS solution to optimize public cloud utilization and spending. Samir has over 20 years of experience leading engineering teams and cloud infrastructure projects across startups and large enterprises like AWS and Teradata. Thanks for joining us today, Samir.
My pleasure.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to begin. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to begin kind of on your personal journey, right? Let's get a little bit about you and your experience and what makes you tick. So, Samir, how did you first get interested in technology and engineering? Did you start in a technology background, or is this some transition for you?
Yeah, I've been at the technology from the get-go. Did my engineering, did my master's from Boston University. I was fortunate to work with pioneering technology companies, first ever B2B e-commerce server, first ever voice translation system, first ever telecom grade voice response systems. And that just got me hooked onto the technology world, working with pioneers, industry leaders, somebody who was defining the new way of doing things. And there was no looking back after that.
And in your career journey and kind of looking through your history, you founded a number of startups. Can you walk us through kind of those moments where you were like, I'm tired of my 9-to-5 job, or probably more like 9-to-8 job, and you wanted to start your own firm?
Yeah, sure. So you can be tired of 9-to-5 jobs and you choose to do 24/7 jobs. That's how startup journeys are. So I spent more than a decade in corporate world in technology industry, and then got started on my own startup. I did, this is my third startup. The first startup was very interesting. That was more than a decade ago. We ran it for a few years. It was acquired successfully. So got some best of success. Once you are bitten by the startup bug, there is no way you can be cured out of that, right? So you have to go back and keep on doing it over and over again. So that's how I am. That's who I am. So first startup was called MobiPrimo. It was mobile data management. We did pretty well there. As I mentioned, it was acquired. Second was called mSauda. It was for mobile commerce for masses, where the masses could be on the wrong side of digital divide, who are not having the privileged big screen interface or internet bandwidth, and how to make e-commerce like experience available to them. So that was the second startup. We did not do all that well. We couldn't raise enough money in time, and we had to pull the plug. So went through both the kinds of experiences, good and bad. And the third startup is probably something where I have learned out of my mistakes and trying to build something better than the first two. So this is Zopt, as Matt you mentioned in the introduction, and I've been building it for a little over a year now.
So when you founded these startups, was it because you were, something that you saw that the entities like AWS and Teradata weren't really addressing? Or is it just something, like you said, that you had a couple instances there where firms that were interested in mobile devices, and then now you're interested in cost optimization? Just kind of curious how these ideas spawn.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started my first startup, I used to work with a company called Persistent Systems. I founded their mobile business. I ran that mobile business, grew it to a sizable business, and saw a lot of interactions with users of mobile technology, mobile device manufacturers, enterprise mobility vendors, and enterprise mobility development companies. And I was kind of expert. iPhone, Android were new, and people were just coming out of the Nokia, Symbian, Motorola, and Samsung proprietary platforms. And I got into the mobile part because that was the domain which was exploding at that time. Now we have billions of devices on iOS and Android, and that time we were probably 1/100th of that population in mobile world. And so I saw that as a big opportunity, and that's why I went after that. Coming to the current startup, uh, I've been associated with cloud industry in different forms. My first two startups ran on cloud on AWS. I was customer of AWS, and that was in year started with 2010, right? So been 14 years into the cloud industry. Worked with companies like Aerospike and Teradata, where I had significant responsibility for cloud, and we were a cloud ISV partner. And those were across all three clouds, Google, Azure, and Google, Azure, and AWS. In between, I worked with AWS for over 5 years and could see a lot of customers, literally hundreds of customers firsthand, on how they onboard, adopt cloud, how they mature in cloud, how they make mistakes, how they struggle, how they figure out problems to their initial struggle. There are certain problems they able to fix. There are certain problems which are perpetual in nature. And after spending close to 15 years in the cloud world, I understand this space well enough. And that's where, after seeing customers struggle firsthand, we decided to form this company.
You mentioned that the opportunity to form Zopt really came from, customer struggles now and being in the industry. That struggle is absolutely real. Where do you see the biggest waste or inefficiencies, however you want to define that, with companies that are using public cloud platforms today?
So before that, right? Let me just give you a broader perspective. In all this last 15 years or so, I've been working on public cloud. After talking to probably 500, 700, maybe 1,000 customers, I haven't yet met a single customer who's happy paying their monthly bill. That's a very big statement, and I hope I'll be proven wrong someday, right? That's how big the problem is, right? So almost every customer gets onboarded on cloud because cloud has a lot of advantages, right? You can deploy infrastructure in few seconds, few minutes. You can have global reach. You can have elasticity. You can pay as you go. And those are all good things. That gives you a lot of empowerment, right? But every empowerment comes with responsibility. And if the responsibility is not handled right, then it could lead to certain problems. So cost overruns is a problem because people have been entrusted with the responsibility, and because the domain is so complex, they don't know how to use that responsibility in a responsible way, right? Too many words of repetition, responsible. But cloud is not becoming easier. As with every day, there are more and more newer features, newer services, newer products that are getting added. The breadth is mind-boggling. All the three large public cloud providers take pride in saying we rolled out so many new features, so many new products. And these are, if you consider it as Lego pieces, if you go out and buy a Lego set in market, you have a manual how to put those 1,000 pieces together. Now, when you're building something on cloud, you have those 1,000 pieces. The pieces themselves are changing. They are evolving. There are newer pieces getting thrown into the mix, and you do not have that manual. You don't even know what is the end goal is, right? How the end model should look like. And when you're on that journey, you are going to make mistakes. Even if you're not making mistakes, certain pieces outgrow, your requirements outgrow those pieces. And there are newer pieces which are better suited for your requirement, right? So this is what makes it very, very complex. So it's a totally dynamic environment where customers' use cases are changing on a regular basis. Customers' usage patterns are changing on a regular basis. And the services, features, products provided by cloud provider are changing on a regular basis. So when you make this as three-dimensional dynamic equation, it is very, very hard to tame the beast. That's where the problem is.
Do you think that's more of a function of how organizations are structured in their IT firm or their IT department rather than necessarily the cloud itself, or some combination of both?
The way I look at it, the root cause is because before you are called expert in any domain, I would quote Malcolm Gladwell, the Outliers book, where it says you have to spend 10,000 hours before you're expert in anything. Now, one, if cloud is not your primary objective, or you're using cloud for your business, you might be more focused on your business, not focusing on the cloud as a technology for that 10,000 hours before you're expert. Before you spend 10,000 hours, the puck has moved. So before you are expert in something, you are required to pick up newer things, either because your use cases are different, your traffic patterns are different, your demand patterns are different, or the cloud provider's technology pattern has changed. So it's a dynamic amoeba kind of equation which keeps on changing its shape and form, and understanding that. And nobody can really say I'm expert in cloud because cloud is evolving so fast.
So if you're a CEO and you're in a position now to where your bill is 2 to 3 times more than what your CIO or your CTO said, I think a lot of them that we experience is that they don't really understand the difference between traditional IT, which was like, well, we used to run data centers and had all kinds of servers and storage arrays and all of that in there, and that changed all the time. They were always asking me for money. How, if you're the CIO or the CTO, do you explain your amoeba analogy to them? That was a good one, by the way.
Yeah, I think there are other problems too in the mix, right? And I'm a person who gives the analogies, right, so that I can convey the points. So think of our kids, right? We give them credit cards, and those kids start spending that money using those credit cards, right? Let's say you give them credit card in Chuck E. Cheese, right? It's typical 7-year-old, 8-year-old you're talking about. It becomes a game for them, right? They are not worried about who's going to pay the credit card bill, or they are not even worried, or they are not even aware that somebody has to pay the bill, right? It's just a credit card swipe, and like magic, they can play the next game. So think of developers and DevOps as those kids in Chuck E. Cheese, where they are responsible for spinning up infrastructure, and they are not responsible for the final bill that comes at the end of the month. Now, if you just expand that and see what the priority for CIO or CFO or CEO is, and what the priority is for the developers and DevOps, there is a sea difference. That leads to the cost overruns. That's one of the problem. Second is the easy approach to fix any problem. I have additional 20% demand in my customer traffic pattern, right? What do? Do I go back and change my architecture pattern, or do I throw more money at the problem and say, okay, let's fix it right now and we'll deal with it later? And then that later may not come in near future or ever, right? So it's combination of multiple problems, and that is because, I'll give you another analogy. If you think of cloud as electricity bill, right? The utility bill that you get at the end of month, it's one line item. You don't know how much is the cost because of your AC or washing machine or the microwave and other things. And if you get that breakup, probably you know that I have to focus on something which are the top 2 or 3 line items in that bill. Maybe you're using old dryer. Maybe the AC is running when it shouldn't be running. Maybe you have to change the mode, certain temperature controls. There are a number of ways you can optimize it. But unless you know what is costing you, you won't be able to do it.
And is that where Zopt enters the picture? Is the concept of why you founded your current organization is to bring some transparency to who and what is driving up that cloud spend?
Absolutely. That's part one of the problem. Part one of the problem is getting the transparency on where am I spending, how my patterns are changing on a daily basis, hourly basis, monthly basis. Then the CIO or the CFO or CEO can say, is my business increasing in the same manner? My costs are increasing 10%, 20%, 30%, but my business is probably increasing at a slower pace. So there has to be something that I have to fix. If you're lucky, you can say my business is increasing at 100%, but my cloud cost is increasing only 30%, right? Then that should not be a big worry. So that's one. Second is, once you know your costs are increasing, what is causing that cost increase? What is causing that cost overrun? That is where the visibility comes into picture. If you're given, let's say, a Yahoo Finance dashboard, right? Unless you have enough technical know-how on how the stock market and trading works, you won't be able to decipher what is your next investment decision. So that's the second part of what Zopt does. Zopt not only gives you visibility, but it also gives you automated identification of opportunities that do this, and it is going to improve your cloud, either performance, availability, reliability, or cost, or combination of those four.
How do you stand apart from the native solutions of AWS and Azure? I'm sure you field that question probably every day.
If you look at where the world was in 2020, 2021 versus 2024, or started in 2023, the cloud providers have realized that cloud cost has become a big concern for their customers. If you look at the reInvent speech of Amazon AWS CTO, it was focused on the frugal architecture. How do you build your system architecture, application architecture on AWS with frugality in mind? Essentially cutting down the cost. The number of features that are launched, I'm just talking about AWS because Zopt only supports AWS at this time. In Cost Explorer, the cost and usage reports, and so on, the pace has accelerated so much in last 12 months. Something that we haven't seen in last probably 5-7 years, right? Because customers are a lot more worried because of the macroeconomic situations. And the cloud providers, all three of them, are worried that if they don't provide that handholding to the customers, they are probably going to see customers moving to alternate solutions like going back to on-prem. And we have seen some examples of customers moving back to on-prem. That is not because they don't like cloud, it is because they cannot tame the beast. That is the nature of the problem. What AWS is doing, what Azure is doing, what Google is doing is necessary but not sufficient. That is where what we provide is going to help customers a lot better than what the native solutions can do.
I'm curious. So I've heard the same thing you have. So 2023, especially the first half of 2023, was very much around optimization. Work the well-architected frameworks, stay where you are. And then it seemed like some of the media pundits, I'd say towards the end of Q3 and into Q4, really started using the cloud repatriation phrase quite a bit more than they had been previously. But when does it actually make sense to shift some of those workloads back to on-prem versus just staying put? Because, and I say that because an organization would have invested a lot of time and energy in the effort to move to the cloud. And there's some cost to move, literally just to move, migrate to the cloud. You do not get to erase that cost when you come back out. So I struggle with that. Like it's large scale. I understand it potentially where you can run your own data center, but for an organization that is moderate or even high scale, it just seems like the cost to actually implement the move would be a deterrent. Or do you see that the same way?
Let's go back, right? Why cloud started, why people started using cloud. So cloud's underlying principle is stop forecasting your infrastructure requirement. Now, if you don't have to forecast your infrastructure, you can say infrastructure is available on tap. I can leverage it as and when I need. That is the underlying principle, right? And for that, you have to have certain ways your infrastructure is architected so that you can get that on-tap demand handled. Now, if you take cloud versus on-prem, and if you have to move back and forth, right? It's like moving your houses, and it's never easy. So just the moving cost and the cost of opportunity, that could erase the benefits that you're going to have. That's part one. Part two is for only certain kinds of businesses, moving back to on-prem might make sense, because what you have to do is you have to do forecasting of your capacity again. You have to build that capacity in your data center, deploy your architecture, deploy your infrastructure, make sure that it's functioning right. And when your next growth peak happens, you should be ready to handle that peak. Now, if you are, let's say, a B2C handling Black Friday traffic, your TurboTax handling your March, April tax season, you are Uber, which is handling unprecedented demands because it rained in a couple of cities, right? It rains in New York and Uber demand peaks up, right? How do you predict that? So certain businesses cannot use that on-prem forecast model unless you want to start paying for your 100% capacity, whatever may happen as a peak, right? But then you're losing that capacity and that cost for remaining 364 days in a year. So it's never an easy solution. If you are a traditional B2B solution where the traffic patterns are very predictable, maybe moving back to data center could work for certain businesses. For a smaller businesses, as you rightly said, Matt, they may not have the necessary relations with the hardware providers, relations with the data center providers, colo providers, and doing that is hard. Also, let's not forget, you require different skills. If you're managing cloud infrastructure, you require different skills. If you're managing on-prem, you require different skills. Now, you're stuck between a wall and a hard rock. So that is the nature of the problem.
Yeah, and I'd say that skill, you hit the nail on the head. I was actually going to ask you a question about that, but that skills gap is, I think, in conversations that I have with executives, is they're not really understanding that, is that if you repatriate some workloads, you remodeled your team to be able to run in, let's just say, AWS, those skills that you had in running data centers, or even if you outsource that part, but running a VMware cloud or a Nutanix cloud or whatever you want to pick, there's an alternative there. Now you have tools for each one of those, most likely, right? So your software costs go up, your people costs go up. It just, like I said, it seems a much more difficult problem than just saying you're not happy with your bill, so let's move you back to where you were before, because they weren't happy there either. So give me a little bit of context around like cultural shifts, or is there a way to better architect clouds to prevent organizations from doing, I guess what would be a mass repatriation event?
So think of situation where you own a single family house, right? You are not happy with the monthly mortgage payment that you have to do, and you decide to move into a rental place, right? Completely different ball game, right? Your square footage is different. Your backyard, front yard is different. You may not have garage, right? So there are lots of things that come with that decision. Now you're trying to save your monthly payment cost by X, right? Your moving cost will put you back by 3 months, 6 months before you can get to break even. And then you probably are not happy with the new way of doing things. And if you decide to move back after a year again into single family, right, then you're incurring that moving cost again. So that's where people are making those decisions or struggling to make those decisions because it's not an easy decision. Part one. Part two is I talk to lots of companies, especially the younger startup kind of companies, who are given credits from these cloud providers. You go to AWS, Azure, Google, everybody has their credit programs. And you're running in cloud A versus cloud B, and the other cloud provider says, come and work with me, I will give you $100,000. They go through similar kind of struggle. And before you realize, you have taken a setback on your business because you're focusing on moving that infrastructure, which is undifferentiated heavy lifting. You could have used those resources for advancing your business rather than moving infrastructure from one provider to other provider, which is not getting your business in any better shape. You could have some dollars saved, or you could have earned some free credits, which evaporate in few months, few quarters. So I think one has to take a longer term approach and evaluate how can I make the existing infrastructure better? How can I get to the world where I'm more efficient in using that infrastructure rather than trying to change the infrastructure because I cannot handle the current infrastructure? I think that's what it boils down to.
So I'm sure you've heard a similar thought as this, is that if I just containerized my entire organization, now I can move all of these applications between AWS, Azure, Google, and I can take advantage of spot rates. And, I have not seen a lot of that materialize. So give me your view of how containers can help in the current situation with this kind of, problem that we're talking about. And then where do you see that, 5-10 years? So just get the kind of how do I use it now? And then where do you see that the container vendors could really help the user community in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So we grew with my gray hair, you can say, I've seen the bare metal world, right? Then we got into the virtual machine world. Then we got into the container world. So we are dividing the bare metal capacity into smaller chunks, adding multiple layers on top of it. The advantage with virtual machine and containers is it makes it more portable. Definitely, right? Certain workloads can get benefited with the containerization. Your application tier, your middleware can run in a microservices environment, smaller components which are running in containers, and you are having scaling advantages at individual smaller components level. Your inventory lookup is hard, or your pricing engine is hard, right? You can spin up more containers and you can handle that. If you look at the other workloads, if you want to have, let's say, AI/ML job, if you want to have a database, those are heavier operations which may not be really suitable for containers. So containers is not the solution for every kind of workload. It works beautifully for certain kinds of workload. Advantage, you have portability, but that is only for partial of your infrastructure, not for 100% of your infrastructure. Second, if your team is very comfortable working with virtual machines, you are asking them to be comfortable with containers, which is going to require time. You are doing re-architecture from monolith to 3-tier to containers to microservices. That is going to be a cost, right? So I think it should not be a hype cycle, right? It should be something that one carefully thinks through, that this is an architectural pattern I'm going to adopt for next 5 years. And if that is giving out to be all good green signal saying that, okay, this makes sense, and this is the investment, this is the ROI, then one should definitely do it. But if that is because everybody else is doing it, so I should, right? I think it has a limited upside to it.
Oh, I think, yeah, I agree. And we saw many organizations refactor that cloud first aspect. So this could be the same thing, container first aspect, just because my neighbor or the CIO that I know down the road is doing it. And we've seen that definitely change. So if this is your kind of core world, where if I'm in containers now and I'm using Kubernetes, for example, they're pretty effective, but they're not terribly efficient sometimes in the way that they're deployed. So where have you seen in Zopt where you could really optimize, a Kubernetes cluster?
Certainly. So we talked very briefly about Zopt, right? So let me tell you what we do first, right? Before I talk about the containers part. So we talked about getting visibility into what the provision infrastructure is. What is it you're paying for, essentially, right? So in the cloud world, there are two kinds of charges. One, where you say, I'm gonna pay for this, give me one virtual machine, give me one hard drive, give me one database, and so on. And then there are multiple charges which are for your usage. How many IOPS you're using, how much data is being transferred between regions, between region to internet, and so on. And there are charges based on that. There are charges based on how many disk IOs you're doing. Now, that is the usage-based charge. So that is what one constitutes in your bill. If you're provisioning something, that's easy to say, okay, this is what I'm going to pay at the end of the month. But the usage-based charges are very hard to figure out on how many HTTP calls I'm going to get on my system in a month. And based on that, I'm going to pay so much for HTTP or API gateway, and then it triggers a Lambda behind it. So Lambda charges me certain things for per call. Then it makes a database call, and I have to pay certain price for per database call, right? And then it becomes a very, very hard to imagine. When your bill spikes up, you have no control or no insight into why, right? Which of these components are contributing to this, right? So one is visibility, that's what we provide. Second is, we take your provision infrastructure usage patterns. We recognize there are certain over-provisioned resources, right, which could be adjusted. There are certain resources which are getting overused, right, than what you have provisioned for. And maybe there are better resources that could be deployed. Third is, based on your usage pattern, there are different classes of services that are available that could be deployed. So going back to my Lego model analogy, right? So there are certain parts which should not be part of your model. There are certain parts that needs to be replaced, and certain parts that needs to be replaced so that you get better reliability, better performance, lower cost, right? So we do that identification, and what we do is based on literally the founding team's experience of working with 1,000 customers and saving them more than $200 million over years. Once we have identified that, it comes with certain confidence score. That confidence scores tell us that this has worked with so many customers, so it should work with this customer too, right? By the way, this customer has different architecture. This customer is in different industry. It is in regulated industry versus a B2C or whatever is the pattern. And we make that adjustment for our identified optimization opportunity. Once that opportunity is identified, we guarantee that if you're saving cost with this opportunity, it is not going to affect your performance. So we guarantee that. You won't see any player or maybe a couple of players who can guarantee that performance protection when they're reducing the cost, which is very, very hard. And third thing that we do is even more beautiful is if you want to implement that optimization, identified optimization, we offer a single click implementation. So we call it automated remediation, and that saves efforts, skills, know-how, human error in the equation, right? So we do this end-to-end visibility, automated identification, automated remediation, and you get that true complete value from the equation. Now, coming to the containers world, containers charges are of different kinds. One is how many nodes or how many virtual machines you have configured. If I have to use AWS terminology, how many EC2s are configured for running your container? And that could be a dynamic pattern. How many storage volumes, the AWS world, EBS volumes are configured? You are paying for that. Third is you are paying for the data transfer charges. You are paying for the control plane charges where you are managing the cluster. Fourth is within a EC2, within a virtual machine, you are deploying number of containers. Now you could have a virtual machine which has capacity of 100, you have containers which has individual capacity of 10, you have only deployed 3 or 4 or 5, right? Leaving other 50% capacity unused, essentially wasted. So there are different flavors of where you're spending, what is that you're using. And our help to the customers is identifying, are you using the right Lego pieces, right? Going back to the same analogy, can you cut down on certain Lego pieces that are not required in the model? Can you have different, better Lego pieces in the model so that you can get better reliability, availability, performance at lower cost? And the last one is, can you get better packing of those container pods in your nodes? And how do you achieve that, right? And that requires you to look much deeper into the usage pattern on what is the per hour usage for your VM capacity to the pod capacity used, right? And then based on that usage pattern, you can recommend them certain strategies which can help them save money, right? So it's a lot more surgical operation, right? It sounds very simple, but in order to get a single data point, right, it requires a lot of effort, right? And getting these 3, 4, 5, 7 things and then mapping it to what worked with other customers and why it should work with this specific customer requires a lot of domain knowledge.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no dial on these that say go really fast or go really cheap, and you can just sit there and tune it with one knob. It's far more complicated than that. In the lens of that, with AI being probably the buzziest buzzword we've heard in a couple of years, machine learning, all that. What emerging or cutting edge technologies are you excited about that could kind of transform these problems that we're talking about?
So I have a slightly different take on this, right? Maybe a controversial take. So you see a lot of hype cycles, right? Let me go back a few years and talk about blockchain, right? There was a lot of hype, a lot of investment to it. A lot of VCs burned their money in that process. And what happened is the real use cases have started emerging in the recent past, right? It has taken multiple years before people could really take certain problem statements, solve it with the blockchain, right? I'll give you an example of data mart, right? If you have rich data and you want to lend it out to certain, let's say you have clinical data, you want to give it out to some research groups. You can rent it out rather than sell or get a perpetual license kind of revenue on that, right? Now, with the blockchain, you can see that that data is getting transferred, that data is getting verified. It is the right verified data that somebody has access to for certain pre-approved time. So you can have lots of checks and balances in the process. Now, that is the kind of use case it took multiple years after the blockchain hype cycle kind of died out, right? The recent AI, generative AI kind of hype cycle, right? I think it will take a few years before the hype cycle dies out and the real use cases emerge. Because right now, I see a conflicting message in the industry, whether your model is a differentiator, whether your data is a differentiator, and then there is a huge chatter about what data sources should be used, what is the risk of I using my confidential enterprise data into Gen AI, and am I risking exposing my data, right? So there is a lot of work that is happening, but I think it's very, very early before the money making or the viable business models on Gen AI are going to be here.
So more of an answer looking for a question. That's that, is it?
Yeah. So I see probably hundreds of companies who got funded in last 12 months on Gen AI. Very lofty valuations. I talked to a bunch of PCs in my network, and they have their own doubts whether they're going to make money on those deals.
So that perspective is always very interesting to our audience, right? Is that, you've founded multiple startups, you've raised money, you've hit strides where you've been very successful. You've hit strides where it's like my startup didn't work, right? Because I couldn't raise enough money. What if you were talking to the audience directly? What like key lessons would you say that continue to help you in your approach today? What's the without the magic recipe? What could you share with the audience?
Absolutely. So there are two kinds of businesses, right? One is where you create a new category, which is very, very hard, right? AWS created cloud, right, which is very, very hard. Or I talked about the B2B e-commerce, the first ever B2B e-commerce that I was lucky to work on. Now that's a very hard category because you have to educate your buyers, right? And that requires a significant expertise, significant money, and elongated time scale. Second is where the problem is already understood, the problem is already recognized, and you are going to offer a solution. Now that solution could be a vitamin versus painkiller. Vitamin selling is easier in good times, but when the economy takes a nosedive, like what we saw in the last couple of years, right? The vitamin decisions would be always delayed. But if you are selling a painkiller, probably that is not something you can avoid, right? You cannot delay. If you need Advil, you need Advil, right? So that's how the situation is. So if you can identify painkillers, if you can identify existing recognized problem, and then if you have domain expertise as your founding team for that problem statement, either you have lived through that problem, you have experienced that problem, or you have helped number of customers solve that problem, then you understand that problem a lot better than most others. And that is where your solution is going to be a lot more suited, a lot more effective for that problem statement. So it's hard, and but I think startup is never easy.
No. Samir, as we wrap up our session, if you wanted an audience member to remember one thing from our conversation today, what would that one thing be?
I think there are decisions one can make, and going back to your comment, Matt, about people moving across clouds, people are moving cloud to on-prem, vice versa, right? There are certain decisions which are costly decisions. Do your homework before you make those decisions, and before you make those decisions, think about your existing situations and how that could be optimized so that you don't even have to make that difficult decisions. That difficult decision is no longer required. And I think that's one thing I would like everybody to remember. If you want to optimize your AWS, right? We have a solution, and would be happy to help you out.
Great. Samir, thank you for your time. I'd also like to thank our audience, and that concludes our episode of Cloud Currents.
Thank you very much, Matt.